All right, we're just about at 1 o'clock. Jean, if you want to take it away.
Let me unmute and make sure I'm here, and just we'll continue to welcome people as they come in today. And I'm really happy that you all have joined us for today's workshop, because this conversation is one that I've really been wanting to have for a long time with a woman who you might have heard on the HerMoney podcast. Ruth Thomas is Chief Product Evangelist at Payscale. She was our guest for episode 322. I can't believe we've done that many episodes, but indeed we have, which was entitled Let's Talk Fair Pay. And in that episode, we really dug into what it means to get paid fairly and earn more. And today, we're just so excited that Ruth has agreed to join us once again to get really, really tactical. I mean, you guys know me. I'm all about the tactics and the strategies. And so we're going to walk through some of the conversations that you are likely to have when you're trying to determine whether you're being paid fairly, and what to say when you go in to talk to your manager to ask for a raise. I am a big fan of doing practice conversations for many, many things in my life, but particularly with anything in the career space, whether it's interview practice, salary negotiation practice, when you are starting a job, raise negotiation, once you already have a job. Just a few statistics for all of you to set the table here. According to Payscale's 2022 compensation best practices surveys, 50% of companies right now said that they are adjusting their pay strategy or their pay structures this year. And 66% say that pay equity analysis is a planned initiative this year. That's a 20% increase over last year, which is pretty remarkable. And it's also, I think, a real sign of the times, right? There's been so much written and talked about when we visited the Great Resignation, when we've talked about wage increases. Companies are clearly listening and understanding that they may have to improve their behavior, so to speak, in order to keep their talent and keep their talent happy. And so if you've been looking to receive a raise, now is the time to engage. All too often, though, we either don't ask for a raise, or when we do, we don't get the answers that we want. According to Payscale's Raise Anatomy report, just 37% of workers say that they've ever asked for a raise from their current employer. So today, we are going to walk you through not only how to prepare to ask, but also how to respond if your request is denied. So Ruth, let me say a big hello to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be back, Jean, and continuing this important conversation.
Absolutely. The other face that you all see on your screen is Kelly Hultgren from HerMoney. She is our head of business development, but today she is serving the role of paying attention to your questions as they come in. So Cal, as people have questions that they want to ask, what's the best way for them to do that? Do you want it in the chat? Do you want it in the Q&A? I always get confused.
Thanks, Jean. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So there are a few different ways you can engage in today's conversation. First of all, thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We're going to work through some of those, but you also see a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can use that. We'll pull questions from there. You could also raise your hand. That's going to signify for us that you are comfortable to come on screen and ask your question in front of everyone, or propose maybe what you want to take into this type of conversation and role play it with Jean and Ruth. Like, totally up to you. We are recording this, which is important to note. So I want to let you guys know, for people who weren't able to join today, we are going to have the recording. So if you want to know that in advance for how you want to answer your question or ask your questions, Anonymity is also totally fine. And for the questions that came in advance, we're only using your first names. I wanted to put that out there as well. So those are the few options. And if you've attended a HerMoney happy hour or virtual event before, you know the chat is for you to engage all throughout with comments, add-ons, considerations, talk amongst the other attendees, have a lot of fun with it. And we're so grateful that you're here.
So Patty already asked a question in the Q&A. She wanted to know if we have muted the participants. Zoom is having some issues today. We tried to sign on for our early morning meeting. None of us could even connect. So I'm very happy that it's working right now. But Kelly, is everybody muted? And can I also just say, if anybody wants to role play, I am down for that. That would be so much fun.
Me too. I hope maybe that happens. So Patty, thanks for asking that. You are muted technically. So the only way that we'll be able to hear your voice and see you potentially is if you raise your hand and I bring you on screen. Otherwise, you are behind the scenes technically. So if you need to take a call or you have something else going on, you're good. You're good to do that without worrying about us hearing what you're doing.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. So Ruth, let me turn it over to you for a second. Tell us a little bit about you. How did you get into this field and what are the changes that you've seen, especially for women since COVID?
Well, you mentioned earlier, I'm Chief Product Evangelist at Payscale. So my role today is really focusing on the future demands of the workplace and what we need to do in terms of shaping our product strategy. So my background, though, is really, I've been an HR and compensation specialist for all my career and kind of over 30 years of experience advising companies and building compensation structures internally with organizations. So hopefully that puts me in good stead today to answer your listeners' questions and hopefully, do some of those role plays. I've also spent quite a lot of time recently in the last 4 or 5 years focusing on the whole topic of pay equity or equal pay. We've been building technology to support clients, but I'm now kind of like an active speaker globally on the whole pay equity movement, something I'm very passionate about. So, that's one of the reasons why I'm so keen for, us to be having conversations and why we're very keen at Payscale for that. So I think you asked, what changes have we seen for women since COVID, in the hiring landscape? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we do know that the pandemic had a disproportionate effect on women and minority groups. And that's, for reasons that they were more heavily represented in sectors most impacted and still in terms of recovery today. We also know many women left the workforce during the pandemic period in order to fulfill their kind of caring responsibilities and their responsibilities as mother with all those children, being homeschooled. Many found it, too hard to balance both managing that home life and the work life. Unfortunately, our research kind of supports the fact that as women come back into the workforce, they are often penalized as well. So we know that unemployed women face a disproportionate wage penalty compared to unemployed men when they come back into the workforce. And we see that played out in our gender pay gap report research. It's another piece of research that we publish annually in March every year around US Equal Pay Day. And so, we know it's been a tough time. But we know that many employers are thinking and addressing, as you mentioned earlier, the need to address pay equity and making sure that there's a level playing field going forward.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'm just wondering, and this is an even more recent question. I know that I'm not sure if you have data on it since it seems to be happening in real time, but over the last just month or so, I'm starting to really see headlines that say, hey, this paradigm that we've been experiencing where workers have the power and where people are able to swap jobs and find lots of additional opportunities is changing fairly quickly. And we're seeing some companies, particularly the early beneficiaries of the pandemic, start to have layoffs. I mean, is it happening that fast?
But it's strange, isn't it? Because it's literally probably 3 or 4 weeks since we spoke last, and it's pivoted in that time. And I'm on all the HR wires. I'm seeing kind of all this information coming down the wires. So when we last met, we were talking about a hot, tight labor market,
Right.
with the power very much in the hand of employees. We've seen wage inflation, price increases, which was really leading people to feel more confident about going to their employers and saying, now is the time for me, to have a pay increase. And we also know people were trying to kind of catch up after the 2 years of the pandemic, because many employers suppressed wages. Some employees took pay cuts during that period, and obviously some people took themselves out of the workforce. But you are right, all the economic indicators, we look at the BLS data for the end of May, inflation now is at its highest level for over a decade. Wage inflation still minorly went up at the end of May, but real wages, because of that inflation, are still coming down. And as you say, we're seeing employers across all sectors, but even in those, what we would deem to be, the sectors where they're seeing the most business activity, like tech, starting to see headlines of people laying off employees. I think I think we will potentially see a shift over the next 12 months, but I don't think employees are going to lose all the power that they've had, because what we do know is that many employers still have a huge demand for skills and talented, a talented workforce, and all the business transformation that they're going through at the moment. They're going to need workers with great expertise, and workers with experience, and workers with skills to help them affect that transformation. But we may see a potential kind of slowdown in the rate of activity that we had experienced in the last 9 months.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for answering that. And I just think it's really important, as we have these tactical conversations, and I'm going to turn to them right now, to be able to take the temperature of your particular environment, right? To know, this is the industry I'm in, this is how it's doing, this is how well the company is doing, these are my skills, and this is where they're strongest, and where they may need to be brushed up.
Mhm.
So when we talk about pay raises, right, and not only raises, but title changes, increases in benefits, increases in flexibility, one of the questions I think that happens most often, or that we see most often, is, it hasn't been a year for me since I had this conversation the last time. Do I have to wait for an annual review in order to tee this up? Or can I schedule some time with my supervisor just because I feel like it?
Well, I think, now is, if you have concerns about your pay, now is as good a time as any to have that conversation. And I think if you think about that against the context of increasing pay transparency that we're seeing in organizations, and also pay transparency legislation that we're seeing starting to spread across states in the US, with employers having to publish pay ranges, we're seeing many more employers being proactive against this. So against that background, I think your employer would probably expect you to be coming to them to want to have conversations about pay. And I think for everybody on this call, I would say, you have a right to discuss your pay. And so I would encourage you to enact that right, and at any time that you feel is the right time for you.
So when we have these, whenever we discuss this topic, whenever we discuss salary negotiation, I catch myself saying, okay, well, you really have to prepare to have this conversation. You really have to do your homework. But what specifically does that mean?
Well, there's a few things you can do. The first thing we always kind of describe is knowing your worth. And we're lucky today that there are many resources where we can go externally. If you get just going to Google and searching, you can find pay information much more readily than you could do a decade ago. At Payscale, we have our employer reported data. It's just been renamed. It was previously called crowdsourced data, but that's a really useful data set for you to be able to go to. So if you if you go to our website and you take the survey, you'll receive a personalized pay report back from that, which will give you a pay range for your job. Now, the important things to know about that data set, because there are many data sets out there, is that it is huge. We have over 65 million profiles in there. We've also been collecting that data for over 20 years. So we've been learning a lot about that data over that time. And that helps us to basically, improve the quality of that data. So, we actually end up potentially, rejecting a number of the people's data that from that survey because we just don't consider it validated. So, that's why we always say, that employer reported data, that survey is a really trusted source of data. Of course, there are other places you can look. I mentioned earlier, companies we're seeing becoming more prevalent in terms of putting pay ranges on job adverts. So, take a look at the job adverts in your location for similar roles to your own, and you may find you'll probably pay ranges posted on that, and that will help to calibrate with the information that you've taken from our survey. And I think you also need to prepare yourself individually for that conversation as well. So, to make sure that you have a productive fact-based discussion. So simple things like knowing your pay history. Don't assume your manager is going to know your pay history. I know we all struggle sometimes to know, find the pieces of paper that told us what our pay raises were over the last few years, but it is important to prepare yourself for the conversation. Also be prepared to state your case on your performance and your contribution, because the conversation may go that way in terms of, this is why I think I should be paid, what I want to be paid, and even think about career progression and where you might want to go, because part of the conversation may pivot towards, in order to progress your pay, you would potentially have to move into this role or this role. So, giving yourself a little bit of time just to think about those things too are all useful preparation.
So I just want to focus on something that you said in like the last two sentences, that sometimes in order to progress your pay, you have to move to a different role. That's because different companies have different salary tiers, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain how transparent those tiers are and how you can find out what they are typically within your company?
Well, at the moment, there's quite a broad spectrum in terms of employers and their approach to pay transparency. We always describe it as a spectrum at Payscale. So kind of at the one end, you've got employers with no transparency, and probably, transparency equates to the pay slip that you get, at the end, or at the end of the month, or how often you get paid. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got some companies in, young startups in the tech sector who publish all their salaries online, and in between, there's kind of every other shade of grey, kind of in between that. So I think, you can find out your company's level of transparency. So, we always encourage people to ask some, key questions around things like, am I paid fairly compared to my peers? Is there a pay range for my role, or how do you decide, how my pay is set? And your employers, normally have done a whole load of work to get to the point where they've decided what you're going to be paid. It's being able to have those conversations with them about how they've set your pay that's important, and sets up that level of transparency.
Gotcha. Muting here selectively just because the dog is unmuting himself very selectively in the background.
He obviously thinks he's not being paid enough.
Clearly he's not. He's not. Kelly, we got a question in the Q&A from Jamie, and I'd like to tee that up because it actually ties into exactly some of the points that you were making here, Ruth. I mean, we talk a lot about making the business case, right? I have brought this sort of value to the company. It will, I have saved the company money. The company would have to spend X dollars in order to hire somebody like me. Jamie's question is interesting.
Yeah, she's wondering, I often hear when asking for a raise, make it a business case like we're talking about right now, but is it okay, or why isn't it, to leverage personal or lifestyle changes as a case or a reason why you deserve a bump? For example, inflation is high, or you had a baby and are paying X amount for childcare right now. Is it okay to incorporate those personal reasons into building that case? If so, how?
Well, I would say it is okay, because you're coming at this from an individual lens. You want to be able to explain to your employer why it's important that you potentially feel that you need more pay. I would say on the reverse side of that organizations normally set their pay strategy not based on those factors. So when they're setting a pay strategy, or when they're determining the pay for your job, what they normally do is they will understand the work that you do. They will bench that, mark that data to market. So one of the other things we do here at Payscale is provide market salary data to employers so that they can establish what the market rate or market range is for a job. And then they may take that market data and create internal pay ranges, and they will decide where they're going to pay you relative to those ranges based on what we call compensable factors. So compensable factors are things like the experience that you have, potentially location, potentially educational achievements that you have, and of course performance, because for a long time we've incorporated pay for performance into base pay. So they're normally the things that an employer is thinking about when they're deciding your pay. So they're probably not thinking, inflation is to one side. Well, I'll come back to talk about that, but they're probably not thinking about, my childcare costs have increased, or I'm just wanting to go out to take a new mortgage. But you're quite within your rights to be able to express those concerns and talk about that with your manager, and talk openly with your manager about that. Inflation, I think you did mention in there, many employers do build in an element of kind of cost of living into their sort of annual increases. And so obviously many employers are aware currently of the level of inflation that's going on. We're all probably worried about how we're going to pay our bills, as costs are completely increasing disproportionately at the moment. And that is kind of a strategy that employers do put into how they determine pay. I hope that answered your question, Jamie.
No, I think it's a very, very interesting point. Let's take one more from Laura, and then we'll go back and do some role playing. And for anybody who wants to role play with us, now's the time to raise your hand. So Laura writes that she has scheduled some time with her boss, but then her boss left the company. And she reached out to HR, who basically stated that she would need to add more responsibilities in order to merit a raise and a promotion, but that promotion was already promised to her by the boss who left. And now she's got a new boss who basically limited her duties. Is this one of those scenarios? I mean, I look at this scenario and I'm thinking, I might be looking around for a job. There's so many factors that are not within your control that have really absolutely nothing to do with what I'm sure is incredibly stellar performance. I mean, sometimes we're just the dominoes or the pieces on the game board, they move around us. Mm-hmm. and we are sort of left thinking this is actually not what I signed up for.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was on the receiving end, so if I was in HR, or I was in reward and I was on the receiving end of that, Laura, you've explained that your prior manager had indicated that you were going to get a raise or a promotion because you'd taken on more responsibilities. Your new manager is now saying, no, that's not going to happen. I would say, okay, I would ask, what do I need to do then in order to progress my pay, and kind of, put them in the position of being able to justify to you what are the concrete things that you would need to do in order to progress your pay. And as you say, Jean, if they're not able to articulate that, then you have to start thinking about, well, is this an organization that I want to work for if they can't kind of create that link between, my needs and what I need to do, and the money I want to get paid.
Yeah. And the frustrating thing is, I mean, and I've had this experience, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, Ruth, but of making a really, really good case being basically turned down because it wasn't the time or it wasn't the particular salary band, going out and getting an offer, and then having that current employer come back and say, oh, well, now we'll give you a raise, right? And at that point, I don't know about you, but at that point, I just want to go, right? Because you don't feel valued. We put together some sample scripts that we could talk through, some scenarios that we could talk through. These are real life scenarios. People in our HerMoney community experience them and tell us that they've experienced them. So they are real. And I'd love to know how to react, right? And what to say. Sometimes having the words is really, really important. So let's say I found out that a colleague who has the same job as I do and the same responsibilities as I do is making more money than I do. What do I do? And is the playbook different if the colleague is a man versus a woman?
Well, I think, first of all, in response to that, I would say it's good to know that there isn't one salary associated with the job. So earlier I explained, the process of setting pay ranges, and the fact that, where you fall on a range will depend on those things like experience, skills, location, and other compensable factors. So, what you want to do is be able to have a conversation with whoever is setting your pay. So be that your manager, be that HR, about where you fit in that pay range or into that salary band, and what you have to do to move up that salary band. Now, hopefully they will be in a position to be able to answer that for you. And you, of course, can also gather market data. You said, going yourself, to go back to that know your worth. It's always good to do that in preparation for these conversations. So potentially you don't have to do that, go away, as you mentioned before, Jean, go away, get an offer from another employer in order to negotiate your pay where you are. You can get that market data, from the Payscale survey. Now, I think you also asked, is it different whether you're a man or a woman?
Well, if you find out, for example, that somebody who's doing the same job as you, who happens to be a guy, right, and is getting paid more, or you suspect that, how do you deal with it? And just to follow up, we got a question from Tina. She sent it in ahead of the webinar, so thank you for that, Tina. How do you ask a colleague at the same level what they're making without seeming nosy and unprofessional?
Well, let's go back to the man and woman question first. So I think in that example, again, it's important to understand that you might have picked someone that you think is a fair comparator to you, but there may be reasons why they're paid differently to you. And it may be because of the level of experience, it may be because of a level of skill, or it may be to a level of performance that isn't transparent to you. So, you do need to have an understanding of that, there are different factors that drive someone's pay. And we might think that we're exactly the same as someone else, but there may be specific reasons why people are paid differently. Unfortunately, there's also, with pay, a lot of historical reasons about why we're paid differently. And what we do know when we look at men's pay compared to women's pay is that, generally you see that men are paid more over time than women. And that's because women have taken time out of the workforce. They've had their pay trajectory disrupted for various reasons. And so that's why we see those kind of overall gender pay gaps, that disparity between men's and women's pay. But let's go to Tina's question. So Tina was asking us, you said, about, how do you approach a colleague at the same level, what their salary is without being nosy or unprofessional? Well, I think it's good to be sensitive to the fact that pay is a very personal issue for some people. And that's because it impacts our livelihood. We kind of sometimes associate status with pay. So it's always worth being sensitive to that. But we do know today that employees are much more willing to have those conversations, particularly younger employees. They're less worried about that kind of like status issue. And we've seen it play out in terms of, spreadsheets that have been circulated.
Yep.
the famous Google spreadsheet, that went around where everybody put in their salaries. And then even more recently, I think I saw a couple of examples where people posted on LinkedIn what their pay history was and how they kind of went from one level to another in order to help other people. So I think people are more willing to talk about it. If I was in your position, Tina, what I'd probably say is, I'm concerned that I'm potentially not being paid fairly for my role. Would you feel comfortable sharing what you're paid? They can always say no to that, obviously, but it's kind of a more gentler way into kind of, rather than saying, how are you paid or what are you paid? So
I love those words. Wait, can you repeat them one more time? Because I think there are people who are going to want to write them down.
I would say, I'm concerned that I'm not being paid fairly for my role. Would you feel comfortable sharing with me what you're paid?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. I've also used the words when you're wondering if somebody at a different company in a comparable role is making more than you are, or you just want to know what they're making. You don't have to ask what they're making. You can say, what would a person with my skills make in your company?
Yeah, so you could say, I'm gathering information on my kind of the market worth of my role. What do you think people at your organization would be paid, for doing a similar role to which I'm doing? So
next scenario, you have a salary negotiation, or you have a negotiation where you're talking about other perks of your job, and you regret not asking for more money. You regret not teeing up that you believe that you deserve a higher salary. And maybe it happens when you're given your offer. Is there anything that you can do?
Absolutely. I think, again, this is something that we tend to see happen because of the historical practice of how we've recruited people. So historically, we tend to take the pay that you're on, and we'll maybe give you a little bump up of 5% or 10% in order to hire you into the new role, rather than what we should be doing is saying, what is the rate for the job that you are recruiting, and putting me in the appropriate rate for that job. And what we do know is that, women historically have been most disadvantaged because of that practice. And that's why we're seeing all this salary history bands that hopefully, your listeners have heard about. But, many states in the US now, have those salary history bands in place, which means that you shouldn't be asking, people's prior salary. And that's to try and break that sort of that track record of people coming in on the wages that they've been previously, and bringing with them any pay inequity that they may have experienced in the past. So, again, if you do the research, do your homework, find out, know your worth, and have a feeling that potentially you undersold yourself when you came into the organization, then I would, set yourself up to have that conversation with your manager, and say, I think I'm potentially being underpaid for my role. I've done this research. This is the information I found out. Could you tell me, how I am paid compared to my peers, or, or how you think I should be paid in this organization?
Okay, fantastic. We have a question from Amy, who writes that she has a new manager and she'd like to know when's a good time to approach them for a raise. But before you answer it, Ruth, Kelly, can I just ask you to read Tiffany's question? It's kind of related.
Yep, it is. So I have a weekly one-on-one meeting with my manager. Normally I use that time to talk about ongoing projects, but wonder if I should be using that time throughout the year to help pave the way for a future promotion or pay raise. Any suggestions for how to repurpose that recurring meeting so the pay conversation isn't so ceremonial or out of the blue?
Okay, so let's do Tina's one first then. If good management practice is that when you have that annual pay conversation or that annual performance review, nothing should be a shock and nothing should be a surprise. And so, when you're having your one-to-ones, you should also be talking about your performance and your contribution, and building up that kind of track record throughout the year that is going to help to, you know, go towards an assessment of your performance and potentially the level of pay increase that you may get during the annual cycle. So, you know, make sure that you're highlighting the work that you've done, not just in terms of, you know, this project was complete or this activity was complete, but how you contributed and the value that you've brought, you know, during those conversations. Back to Amy's question, which I think is, you know, I've got a new manager, when's a good time to approach them? Well, I'd probably say not on their first day. You know, I'd give them a bit of a break. But hopefully, again, if they're a good manager, your new manager is going to want to introduce themselves to you, want to set some time to get to know you. Potentially, you know, if I was your manager, I'd be saying, is there anything I can help you with? Are there any issues that you have that I can, you know, help you resolve in order to make sure that you can, you know, be the best you can be here? If they don't, then there's no harm you trying to set some time with them and say, you know, I've got some things that are concerning me at the moment about my role here. You know, can we set some time to discuss this? Again, it comes back to that. We've all got a right to talk about our pay with our managers, and organizations should be prepared to have those conversations with us.
We got a question from somebody who would like to remain anonymous, which, as you all know from our podcast, is totally a-okay. It's a really interesting one, and it's one that my daughter actually dealt with in a previous job. So I'd love to hear your take on it. For those of you who are hourly, I'm an assistant, how would you go about asking for overtime pay as your workload has greatly increased? OT went away at the start of COVID as we were working from home. So I tracked any OT worked in a slush fund, but now I'm working so much more still from home. The slush fund keeps going up and up and up. Thoughts about approaching this with my boss. And you know, what's interesting here, I think, Ruth, is that overtime can be a legal issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be good to ask to revisit that arrangement. For example, you know, where you said the overtime went away. So I would definitely say, you know, explain the situation and say, is it time to revisit that? We understand why potentially, you know, a lot of businesses made decisions to kind of cut back on compensation spend during the pandemic period, and employees, surprisingly to me at the time, because it was probably the first time in my career of managing pay where employees so readily volunteered to give up their rights to pay. But I think we were all collectively in this bizarre experience, and we all just wanted to survive. And so many of us kind of went through that experience. You know, I mean, at Curo, where I was before, at Payscale, we all agreed to take pay cuts in order that everybody could keep their jobs. You know, that was more important to us, which was quite strange. So I would ask to potentially revisit that arrangement, and you know, have that conversation with your manager and explain the situation, that you know, you don't think it's fair, and that you know, that should be reviewed.
Let's talk about what do we do when our request for more money is turned down, because sometimes you go in and you got lots and lots of data to back you up, and you know that you're making your case articulately, and your boss responds in a way that either you didn't expect or you're not happy with, and you don't know how to respond. So we collected some of these rebuttals, and I'd love to know, what do you say when this is what they say to you, if that makes sense? So let's just say I go in, I make my case, and I'm told there's just not enough money in the budget.
Well, that can be, of course, a reality. And as we talked about earlier, you know, as we potentially pivot into a recession, that may become more of an issue for businesses. You know, I think, you know, what I would do if I was in that position would be to understand, you know, okay, I understand there might not be budget now, but when is the next time that you would be reviewing salaries, so that you can get some, you know, expectation of time frame, and also, you know, obviously be professional and courteous if you are turned down, but work with your manager to really determine how you can move forward to achieve the goals that you want to achieve in the future. So, you know, you're quite within your rights to kind of say, well, you know, I know you potentially you don't have the budget right now, but my expectation is that my worth is this, and I have done some research. When would you be able to kind of address those concerns or those kind of requirements that I have?
I would imagine that that's something with inflation running so high that companies are, they're feeling it themselves, right? That a lot of companies have not been able to raise their prices to keep up. And so it
Yeah.
may, I mean, it's not an argument that you want to hear, but it may actually be a more
No,
valid one.
and we have also seen, we work with over 10,000 clients, helping them to set their pay and to make sure that they pay fairly. We've seen many employers during this past review season, it normally happens kind of between October and April, have made a more significant investment in their workforces over this period than potentially they have. It kind of feels like there was a lot of catch up happening for those suppressed wages that happened during the pandemic. And we see that played out in our kind of pay data and our pay index data. We know that, pay increases trended at 3% for many, many years. We're starting to see that get, during this period has got closer to 5%. At the same time, we have seen employers making that investment in their talent and in their workforces because they recognize that what is ultimately going to drive business success are the people that work for them.
Let me come back to those percentages that you just rattled off for a second, because we got a question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee asking about the current pay raise percentage taking into consideration inflation and the cost of living. Do you expect to see that continue to rise? I mean, should we be expecting with inflation running so hot, 6, 7, 8% increases?
Well, we saw, I think it did actually, wage inflation from the US BLS data did marginally creep up in May. It's definitely slowed down from the first kind of, the pay progression that we were seeing in the first 4 months of the year. We asked employers as part of that compensation best practice report, what did they expect to pay this year? And for many, there was a large proportion that said they were going to be paying over that normal kind of 3%. I think, we may potentially see it slow down, but for certain jobs and for certain roles, and in particular, certain sectors where we are seeing a lot of labor shortages. And those sectors, ironically, tend to be where we've seen a lot of low pay jobs. They are having to increase their pay. And I think that will be a trend that we will continue to see increase. So, minimum wage increases or commitments to, livable wages going on for many employers.
This another way that we are turned down for raises is with the line that there are people who have been here longer than you, who work hard, and I can't give everyone a raise. And if I gave you a raise right now, it wouldn't be fair.
Well, I mean, they are kind of making the point that I made earlier around there are people with more experience do tend to get paid more money. And when you're looking at a pay range, so when you're determining a pay range, you normally hire someone kind of at the lower end of the pay range, and then as they gain experience, they kind of move up that pay range. So that may be the reason why those people are being paid more. So what you probably want to do as an individual is to say, well, what experience do I have to gain? What skills do I have to gain in order to progress to the same level as those other people?
We're getting a couple of questions about retention raises.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're seeing companies putting those into play in this environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we did see again in that compensation best practice report a huge jump in the use of variable pay. So, moving away from based pay. And when we broke down kind of what type of variable pay or bonus pay was being awarded, what we did see is a lot of hiring bonuses and retention bonuses. So that's where people, they were still trying to manage people's pay within the pay ranges, but in order to get talent in or keep critical talent, they were giving them a kind of one-off payment through some form of bonus in order to do that and keep them with the organization.
When we look at another thing that's sort of coming up is area of the country and a smaller city versus a larger city. What are you seeing as far as the trends in companies allowing people to continue to work remotely from wherever they are and keeping them at their current level of pay, whether or not they live in a place with a higher cost of living?
Yeah. Well, the reality is all a bit messy at the moment still, I think, because most employers or many employers haven't yet settled on their long-term strategy as an, am I a, in the office, hybrid or remote work, and therefore they haven't decided their pay strategies. I think we are seeing more and more employers, start to state their position. We're expecting employees to return to the office. We saw that, with a few kind of prominent companies in the last month. It will be interesting to see what happens there, because they may experience, we know many employees don't return to the office, and if they start experiencing talent shortages, then they may want to adjust their strategy. So in the main, what we are seeing is that employers are basically, going with a location-based strategy. So it's either kind of where you're based or where your nearest office is based is what is the rate that you will be paid to. But there is also discussion from some companies about potentially gravitating towards a national average. And then potentially having, a high cost premium for those kind of metropolitan areas that normally have a higher cost of living associated with them. But there is no one clear way coming through at this moment.
Payscale research reported, and sadly, this is not surprising, that women of color were less likely to have received raises than white men, 19% less likely. What do women of color need to know specifically about the negotiation process? Are there any different rules?
Well, all the advice that we've given so far, about doing your research, knowing your worth, understanding how pay is set within your organization, of course, all that applies. One of the issues we know for women of color is, this intersection of gender and race often creates obstacles to opportunity, and that's at times of hiring, during pay decisions, during promotions, kind of all across the talent life cycle. And so I think it's also important to understand what your employer is doing to address those obstacles as well. And I think you can obviously help contribute to your employer's understanding of that. So potentially it's more about understanding the acronym is the DEI and B, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There are lots of different versions of the acronym, but understanding your company's DEI and B strategy, because addressing those things that do create those obstacles and hurdles are really critical in terms of ensuring fair pay, particularly for women of color.
Well, and I would think, we're right in the middle of Pride Month. I would think that the same strategies probably apply to LGBTQ plus.
Absolutely, and we're doing a webinar, this, I think it's next. It's 2 days time at Payscale. We've got a great webinar. We've got a couple of experts coming in who've published some pay data report on the LGBTQ plus pay gap. So if you want to find more about that and some of the key drivers that causes that pay gap, then do think about joining that webinar as well.
Excellent. I'm so glad that you guys are doing that. Kelly, I want to open it up. What other questions have you been fielding?
Yeah, we have a bunch. And I also just want to flag, we have about another 10 minutes left. So if anyone has any more questions you'd like to submit for consideration, please do. But this one's an interesting one. It's from someone who'd like to remain anonymous. suggestions on how to go about a compensation analysis to present to the board when I, as a co-founder, wear multiple hats in the company. All websites only focus on one title for a person, but I do the job of multiple people, which pulls pages from a lot of what we've been talking about, but this one's an interesting one.
I've been in that position too, as I co-founded a technology company and did many jobs. I think potentially what I would do is I would, it's really talking about your value to the company. I would potentially benchmark, go and do that benchmark for the different jobs that you're doing and saying, if you were to go out to the market and recruit someone who was doing all these different roles, you would be paying, across this broad range of pay, and it may be that some of it's a lot higher than other roles, but it's important for them to understand that if they wanted to get someone contributing the same level as you to the organization, that's the kind of range of pay that they potentially would have to pay.
Great, thank you. And we have one from someone who would also like to remain anonymous. She's the chief of staff. She just got promoted to chief of staff, and she has visibility into everyone's pay. And so with this information, knowing that she has all of the information and knowing that her manager has all of the information, any advice for her approaching her compensation conversation?
Yeah, that can be a difficult one, because what you want to make sure is you're not using the pay data to kind of individually justify your own role. But at the same time, if I was in your position, because I have been in your position, obviously, because I've managed pay at large companies, I would say, you obviously understand that I have access to this data, and I can see that I am potentially, being paid unfairly compared to my peers. Let's have a conversation about this. And is there a reason why you think I'm being paid what I'm paid? Or, is there something we can do to make sure that I am being paid more fairly? So I'd acknowledge the kind of elephant in the room, that you do have access to that information, but that you just still want to have a sensible grown-up conversation about your pay.
We all have to be sensible grown-ups these days.
Unfortunately.
Going back to diversity, equity, pay concerns, someone is wondering if you can bring that up at the front end when you're negotiating your salary at a prospective employer, if that's something you can bring up front and center.
In the sense, what was it? What, as in?
Is it appropriate to ask about diversity, equity, pay concerns as you are starting a new company and negotiating a new salary?
Absolutely, yes. I think potentially, what they may be thinking about is, often you get asked, what's your expectations of the pay for this role, and my favorite answer to that is, well, can you tell me what the pay range is for that role, and I will tell you where I think my pay should fit into that range. Let's have a conversation. I do know that many employees now do focus on an employer's position on pay equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many companies are now publishing their record on gender pay gaps and their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If that is important to you, I would go out and do that research, before you join a company. Because that can give you a good idea of, the environment that you're going into in terms of an employer as well.
Ruth, just to follow up on what you just said, when you're asked how much money you think you should be making in this job, I love that answer. Tell me what the range is and I'll tell you where I think I should fit. It's going to be really tempting for everyone, particularly for all of the incredibly accomplished women on this webinar, to say, well, the top. So where do you actually want to, what's the best number to hit in there, and how do you make the decision?
I think it's very personal, isn't it? It depends where you think your current salary should fit against that. I think it comes back to the putting it towards the organization of saying, well, tell me why I shouldn't be paid at the top of the range. Hopefully they would have a structured answer to say, normally we would expect someone with this level of experience, this level of, or this particular skill set, this is the rate that we're paying for people at that level. I know it is, unfortunately, isn't always the case in all organizations, but you could try that tactic.
Is there ever a case where you think you should throw out a number? I mean, do you adhere to the anchoring philosophy where somebody says you should throw out a really high number because it will get the person on the other side of the table to anchor to that number and start to think that you're worth that much money?
I mean, if they're not prepared to disclose a pay range for the job that you're going into, then really kind of that's the only other tactic that you can potentially go for. And we do see time and time again, particularly for women, that their salaries have been historically undervalued. And we also know kind of from speaking to recruiters that they've had this mindset that if they can get someone beneath the pay range for a job that they've done their employer a favor, they've saved some money. I mean, we're doing a lot of work to try and change the mindset and trying to get that fair pay mindset into organizations and say, what we need to think about is that there is a fair pay range for the job. And that fair pay range is determined based on those compensable factors. And you should think about putting that person into the pay range for their job. And if it means that they're getting a 20% increase, which seems like an awful lot of money to you, ultimately you're paying them fairly, for the contribution, for the experience, and the talent that they're bringing to your organization.
Jennifer asked this question earlier. I wanted to make sure that we got to it. She says, as somebody who's been on the bench for the past 2 years, acting as a primary caregiver, how do you recommend one addresses that feeling of having a lack of leverage in negotiations?
Well, it's a very common experience for women coming back to the workplace from any type of break, and particularly if you've been, out on parental leave. I would say, have the confidence. I think there are many organizations that you can go to, who can help you to kind of have that confidence in terms of coming back to the workforce. Unfortunately, we often undervalue ourselves because of that time out. And we've obviously, doesn't necessarily mean we've lost all the years of experience that we might have gained before we had that time out, and not all, of course, gain new skills during our time as a parent. So, I would encourage you to have confidence in yourself, and, to really take the time potentially to prepare yourself, thinking about your skills. How would you talk about the skills that you have? Maybe meet with a friend, or meet with someone who, a friend who has been working and, doing a role that you're particularly, that you're looking to get into, and maybe bounce ideas off them and say, this is what I think I'm good at, and help get them to help shape, your kind of like what are your skills, what are your attributes, what are you bringing back to the market, and feeling more confident about those.
Yeah, absolutely. Primary caregiver, by the way, hardest job in the world.
For sure.
Absolutely. Ruth, we are almost at time here, and I just want to see if there's anything that you feel like we've left on the table. Anything that you've learned from your research, anything that I haven't asked you about that you think this audience can benefit from as a takeaway?
Well, I think hopefully, all of you that have been listening, you've taken away the sort of the key things that you should be thinking about asking about your pay. So think about those 4 critical questions. How do you benchmark my salary? How do you determine what I'm paid? Can you explain how I'm paid compared to my peers? And what do I have to do to progress my pay? 4 really important questions. We talked about those on the podcast. So if you want to hear more about that, you can go back and listen to the podcast. I think what's important for us here at Payscale is, we really feel passionate about sparking real conversations about pay. And that's what our whole Let's Talk Fair Pay campaign that we've been running has been about. We're in a very privileged position that we help both sides of this conversation, because we help employers with pay data, and we obviously help employees through our survey in order to access data themselves. So, again, really important that if you want to find more information about what you think you should be paid, do take that Payscale salary survey. and and join in the conversation. You can also find on our website lots of resources relating to the Fair Pay campaign. So we've got salary negotiation tips, we've got career management tips, we've got interview tips on there. So it's a great resource center to go in order to kind of prepare yourself for those discussions.
Fantastic. Kelly, any last minute words from you?
Just appreciation for everyone joining us during your work days. And we will send out this recording after the call with additional resources that Ruth and Jean have mentioned throughout this hour. So thank you for joining, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Absolutely. And I know that there's some questions that we didn't get to, particularly questions that came in just the last couple of minutes. We're going to pull those. We'll do a special career HerMoney mailbag. And we will get you answers to those questions. So just keep your eyes open for that. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And Ruth, thank you again for partnering with us on this event. Thank you to the folks at Payscale. Kelly, thank you. And we'll see y'all next time.